Pause for a second. Don't scroll further. Just picture the ceiling above your head. In an ordinary apartment, it's all clear. A slab, walls, a clear load, a clear logic. Now mentally step into an old palace hall. Not a pretty postcard, not a museum fairy tale, but an actual room where emptiness hangs over you for tens of meters. And something is holding that emptiness. And here's where the uncomfortable part begins. For decades, we've been shown gold, stucco, chandeliers, parquet floors, balls, mazurkas, the smiles of empresses. But almost no one suggests asking a simple question. How does any of this even stand? Not in poetry, not in legend, but in physics. How were such spans covered? What held such weight? How were such volumes heated? Who built this? What did they build it with? And why, when you start doing the math, the official fairy tale begins to crumble right before your eyes? The further we go, the less this will sound like a story about a palace, and the more it will sound like an investigation into a foreign, forgotten, or deliberately hidden technology. Because these halls are too large for mere convenience, too complex for everyday explanation, and too strange to believe the first museum plaque. Today, we won't look at them through the eyes of a tourist. We'll look at them as a structure, as a trace, as evidence. And in just a few minutes, it may become clear that beneath the word palace, we've been sold a beautiful sign instead of a real answer. Right where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Look up at the ceiling. It's the simplest gesture that breaks half of the familiar picture. While a person admires frescoes, cherubs, and gilding, they miss the main thing. Above them hangs an enormous span, 20 meters, sometimes 25, sometimes 30. And in the middle of this space, there's not a single support. Not a single column honestly taking on part of the weight. Just a giant void, covered by something from above. In modern engineering, such things don't inspire mysticism for one reason only. We have calculations, metal of known quality, standardized components, factory production, cranes, lifting mechanisms, and design for specific loads. We know what we're risking, so we build in a safety margin. But when the same tasks are attributed to eras where everything was supposedly done almost by hand, with wood and brick, with a horse in the yard, and a candle in hand, the question can no longer be brushed aside. It becomes too loud. We're asked to believe that a society with extremely limited mechanization calmly solved problems that are treated with great respect today, even with modern technology. And it would be one thing if this were a single rare object. But no, such spaces appear again and again. In St. Petersburg, in Paris, in Vienna, in London, in Washington, as if someone used the same principle, the same standard, the same school, which we're now told about vaguely and reluctantly. The most uncomfortable part here isn't even that there's no answer. It's that most people stop asking the question too soon. Beauty blinds. Grandeur switches off logic. We see luxury and think of status. But a structure doesn't know the word status. It can either be realized with specific materials or it can't. And if the span exists, then the builders had a real method, a real technology, and a real industrial base. Otherwise, it would have remained just a drawing on paper. This is where we need to start, not with portraits of architects, not with museum legends, but with bare physics. Because the first question here is extremely simple. What exactly is holding up this ceiling if there's only air beneath it? And as soon as we start unpacking possible answers, the beautiful story of ballrooms begins to audibly crack. We're usually offered two convenient versions. The first, wood. The second, a vault. On paper, it sounds nice. In reality, each quickly hits a wall. Let's start with wood. Anyone who even slightly understands the behavior of a long beam immediately senses a catch. Wood is a living, capricious material, sensitive to humidity, time, and load. Finding a solid element tens of meters long isn't just difficult. For mass construction, it's almost a fairy tale. So that leaves composite structures. But then a new problem arises. Any composite wooden system on such a span requires perfect fitting, good fasteners, precise understanding of force distribution, and constant battle against sagging. Under its own weight, it's already operating at its limit. And on top of that, they hang a ceiling, finishes, decorative elements, and suspensions. And all of this must not just last a season or two, it must stand for centuries. Fine, they'll tell us, it could have been brick or stone vaults. Okay, then let's remember that a vault doesn't just push downward, it pushes outward. The wider the span, the greater the lateral force. Such a ceiling requires either very thick walls, powerful external supports, or a system of buttresses, like in large cathedrals. But what do we see on the facades of palace complexes? Elegant walls, large windows, many openings, a relatively light facade design. No sense that the building is assembled like a fortress to contain monstrous thrust. And here, the first real crack appears in the familiar version. Because you can't assert two things at once. You can't say it was a huge, support-free span made of traditional materials, and then show a facade where none of the structural mass needed to absorb such forces is visible. Physics doesn't make allowances for the era. It doesn't care whose portrait hangs in the gallery or who ruled the country at the time. So we're left with a strange picture. Wood is too risky. A vault requires a different external logic. Yet the hall stands as it always has, looking down at us with complete indifference. So either the real structures weren't what we're told in the simplified version, or we're looking at the result of a technology that's now hidden behind a decorative shell. And then the next question becomes even more uncomfortable. If even the ceiling itself raises doubts, how did it hold everything that was hung on top of it? Now let's look not at the span, but at the load. And here the fairy tale starts breaking down even faster. The ceilings in such halls aren't bare surfaces. They're multi-layered, heavy systems. Stucco, cornices, suspended decorative elements, sometimes massive paintings on thick plaster layers, and of course, chandeliers, not small lamps but huge structures of metal and glass hanging right in the center where the structure should experience the most unpleasant stress. It's one thing to theoretically cover a space from above. It's quite another to sustain concentrated loads at key points for years without noticeable deformation. Because a chandelier isn't just weight, it's weight suspended at the center. It's a load on the mounting point. It's vibration. It's air movement. It's the material working over time. And all of this, if we believe the museum picture, was held by systems created without modern structural engineering science, without building codes in the familiar sense, and without the factory predictability of materials. Here, time behaves especially strangely, because many halls didn't just survive, they retained visual evenness. There are no catastrophic sags. There's no mass deformation, which you intuitively expect from an old, overloaded, complex system. Yes, there were fires, restorations, alterations, but the fact remains, these spaces seem to have been designed from the outset with a margin of safety, as if for the builders such a task wasn't a miracle, but a normal standard. And this already undermines the simple version about ceremonial luxury. Ceremonial function explains the decor. It doesn't explain the technical reliability. Beauty doesn't hold weight. A painting doesn't distribute force. For such a hall to endure decades and centuries, it must have an internal skeleton. And this skeleton is the most uncomfortable subject for discussion because it's often hidden behind plaster, murals, suspended ceilings, and museum legend. Hence grows the feeling that we are not seeing the thing itself, but only its ceremonial mask. We are shown the exterior because the exterior is safe. You can hang a beautiful story on it, but as soon as the question touches on the internal workings of the structure, gaps, omissions, and strange simplifications begin. And then another blow is added to this. Even if we assume the hall was somehow built, It wasn't just meant to be held up. It also had to be used. And here awaits us a story that looks even weaker. Imagine such a hall in winter. Not on a postcard, not on a tour route, but in a live setting. Ceiling height, 10 meters, sometimes more. The area is enormous. The air volume is monstrous. Outside, it's freezing. And we are asked to believe that all this was heated by fireplaces, stoves, and constant wood burning. It sounds familiar enough, but take one step toward common sense, and this entire version begins to wobble. A fireplace is an impressive thing, but extremely voracious and not very efficient. It provides local heat and sends a significant portion of its energy up the chimney. For a cozy room, it might do. For a hall where you can lose your eyesight, it's almost a mockery. To heat such a volume to a comfortable state requires not just a lot of fuel, it requires mountains of fuel, and every day, with constant delivery, storage, drying, and maintenance. And here surfaces what is rarely shown on tours. Where was all this stored? Where are the traces of the gigantic wood reserves? Where is the infrastructure for such an appetite? Where is the logic of constant firing? Where are the blackened ceilings that would have inevitably been smoked again and again? Where are the traces that these fireplaces truly worked as the primary heat source and weren't part of a decorative or entirely different system? The more closely you look, the more you miss the material traces of precisely mass and long-term use. And heating is only half the problem. There's also light. In the evening, such a hall turns into a bottomless volume that needs to be lit. With candles? Fine. Then consider the number of candles, the work of servants, climbing to the chandeliers, dripping wax, soot, constant maintenance, replacement, cleaning, material consumption. The more you calculate, the more the ballroom picture ceases to be natural and begins to resemble a theatrical set, invented after the fact. It's here that an uneasy thought first arises. What if these spaces were not originally created at all for regular, everyday human habitation? What if their current explanation is secondary? What if the function came first, and only later was the legend of balls, receptions, and ceremonies invented over it? Because one thing is a rare ceremonial hall for an exceptional occasion. Quite another is an entire class of gigantic rooms about which we have too many operational questions. And once we acknowledge this, our gaze begins to catch on the next oddity, the very human scale inside these structures. Enter such a hall and try to forget for a minute that you're in a museum. Just feel the proportions. The doors are too high. The windows are too large. The stairs are often inconvenient for a normal stride. Handles, sashes, openings, distances between architectural elements, all of it seems calculated not for coziness, but for a different mode of use. Not necessarily for giants in a fairy tale sense, but certainly not for the domestic comfort of a person 5'7", living in the mode of walked in, sat down, warmed by the fireplace. The official version answers simply, it was done for grandeur, for impression, to demonstrate status. Partially, yes, power loves scale. But even ostentatious luxury has a limit of reasonableness. When proportions begin to systematically work against convenience, a question arises. Why do so many solutions look not just lavish, but functionally strange? Why do huge window sashes look as if they were never meant to be opened by hand for everyday necessity? Why do doors in places resemble technological openings more? Why does the space so often seem calculated for the circulation of something rather than someone? In an ordinary house, everything is subordinated to the human body. In residential architecture, this is felt immediately. Height, width, accessibility, rhythm of movement, everything is tuned for daily use. In vast palace halls, the opposite is often felt. The human is not the master of the space there. They are in it as a temporary guest, as a small figure inside a system created for a different task. Hence, the strange feeling that many describe the same way. You're not just admiring, you've somehow gotten inside something too big and too serious to explain with a single word: luxury. And this feeling cannot be dismissed as mere impressionability. Architecture is a language of functions. Even when it dresses up in decor, its basic logic remains. If a space is inconvenient for domestic life, if it's too large for a simple ceremony, if it requires resources and solutions poorly explained by the official version, then what's before us is not just aesthetics. Before us is the trace of a purpose that was later attempted to be hidden under a safer story. But even if someone isn't ready to accept such a version, there is something harder to brush aside. That is demography and logistics. Because a hall can be romanticized, proportions can be declared a whim of taste, but numbers, as a rule, tolerate less fantasy. And when we start counting not beauty, but construction, the picture becomes very stark. Any major construction project is not about inspiration. It's about people, food, materials, transport, tools, time, housing, organization, security, supply, waste removal, water delivery, and the production of lime, brick, metal, and timber. All of this must work as a single machine, and it is precisely here that the most painful questions begin. We are told about cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands, sometimes less, but the scale of construction attributed to these cities looks as if armies of builders from the industrial age labored over them. Take just one large palace complex. Consider the amount of brick, the amount of stone, the amount of wood, the amount of finishing work. How many skilled hands must have worked simultaneously to meet the stated deadlines? Masons, carpenters, plasterers, roofers, blacksmiths, glaziers, carters, stove makers, laborers. And this is not the only construction site in the city. Simultaneously, embankments, bridges, temples, apartment buildings, warehouses, barracks, and administrative buildings were being erected. At some point, the math begins to sound almost mocking. If we believe the official timelines, it turns out that a significant portion of the urban population must have worked on construction around the clock. But then who serviced the city itself? Who baked the bread? Who sewed the clothes? Who removed the waste? Who provided medical care? Who supplied the army? Who, in fact, sustained life? Economics does not tolerate magic. You cannot simultaneously build gigantic complexes and pretend that everything else somehow fell into place by itself. The logistics of heavy materials look especially absurd in a world where we are asked to believe the main mode of transport was the cart and horse. Animal-drawn transport is good for short hauls and moderate volumes. But when it comes to the flow of stone, brick, timber, and metal for colossal constructions, it becomes a bottleneck. Horses require feed, roads become impassable, speed is low, and volumes are limited. And the more we think about the real supply picture, the more it begins to resemble not an ordinary construction project of the past, but something that must have relied on a completely different level of organization. Hence, the most stringent conclusion emerges. Either the population and industrial capabilities of the past were entirely different from what we are told, or they built with machines and technologies that later disappeared from the official narrative. Or a significant portion of these structures already existed, and later eras merely appropriated them, rebuilt the facades, adjusted the interiors, and wrote a beautiful legend about their own authorship. And once this conclusion appears, the gaze immediately lands on the main material evidence, the metal hidden within old walls and ceilings. The most curious discoveries are often made not on guided tours, but during fires, openings, emergency repairs, and restorations. When plaster falls away, when ceilings are opened up, when floors are lifted, something suddenly appears that is spoken of much more quietly in typical museum discourse. Metal. Not a random detail, not a solitary bracket, but serious load-bearing elements: beams, ties, trusses, joints. And it is here that the calm version of the past begins to behave particularly nervously. Because large structural metal is not about romance, it's about industry. It's about ore mining, smelting, processing, rolling, transportation, machining, drilling, riveting, and installation. To span large spaces with metal systems, you don't need a master with golden hands, but an industrial world with a clear technological chain. And here an uncomfortable discrepancy arises. Many buildings where serious metal is found are formally attributed to an era not typically credited with mass, cheap metallurgy on such a scale. But it's not even just about volume. Look closely at the fasteners. Thousands of identical elements, repetition, standardization, interchangeability. This no longer resembles the image of a world where everything was assembled in a makeshift, almost on-site, almost manual manner, with a perpetual shortage of quality material. A large metal structure is the language of a system. It speaks of production discipline, manufacturing precision, and the availability of tools and equipment without which such repeatability is unattainable. Hence, strange finds like rails used inside old structures, not as transport infrastructure, but as a construction element. It looks almost like a remnant of another era, where a certain type of metal was so accessible that it was put to use without museum-like reverence. For us, a rail is a symbol of the railroad. For those who embedded it in an old ceiling, it was perhaps simply a convenient, standard beam. And this shift in perception alone changes a great deal. The longer you look at the hidden metal in old buildings, the stronger the feeling becomes that we are being shown not the beginning of a technology, but its late shadow. Not the moment of birth, but the moment of using a ready-made system, the origin of which was later compressed, simplified, and fitted into a schoolbook scheme. And if an industrial logic truly resides within these palaces, then not only the construction is called into question, the entire narrative about materials is called into question. Because immediately, two more inconvenient questions arise: glass and brick. With the enormous windows of palace halls, everything is also too smooth not to raise suspicion. For such spaces, light was not a luxury, but a necessity. Without it, the halls would have turned into gloomy voids. Therefore, windows played a key role. But when you look at old complexes, what is striking is not just their size. It's the quality of the glazing, the scale of the openings, and the general sense that all of this was done for a space that was meant to be constantly saturated with light. It's convenient here to repeat the familiar formula about the skill of craftsmen. And no one disputes that the skill was immense. But skill does not negate technological limits. The larger the sheet of glass, the more difficult it is to produce, transport, install, and maintain in acceptable quality. When we are faced with dozens or hundreds of large openings, the picture ceases to be an exception and begins to hint at a production system that was far more serious than is usually stated in the simplified version. The story with brick is no simpler. Perfect geometry, repeatable forms, stamps, even masonry, sometimes astonishing speed of erection according to official data. But brick alone does not build a structure. Mortar is needed. A curing cycle is needed. Technological pauses are needed. Work must be organized so that the lower tiers do not shift under the weight of the upper ones. When we are told about paces at which enormous complexes literally sprang up in a matter of years, one wants to understand on what specific material and according to what scheme this could have possibly happened. This is precisely where some researchers begin to view walls not as honest masonry in our conventional sense, but as a surface concealing a more complex core. In some places, they see traces of monolithic construction. In others, a strange, decorative jointing. Elsewhere, a combination of techniques that don't fit into one simple technology. And while not every such observation is flawless, the core tension of the question remains. Quality, volume, and speed are difficult to reconcile if we believe the overly straightforward version of manual construction in past centuries. But the oddities don't end there, because a building is not just walls and windows. It's also the internal behavior of space, how it sounds, how it gives back a voice, how it holds a wave. And here, palace halls suddenly begin to look not like places for pleasant conversation, but as something whose nature might be tied to a completely different purpose. Try to imagine a normal conversation in a giant hall with a high ceiling, hard walls, and a large empty volume. Now add stone, plaster, smooth surfaces, arches, domed forms. What do you get? Echo, a long tail of sound, muffled speech, a growing rumble. For a ceremonial effect, it's beautiful. For constant communication, it's torturous. And this raises a very uncomfortable question. Why do spaces presented to us as ideal halls for gatherings, receptions, and dances so often appear acoustically questionable? Yes, the interior can be partially softened with textiles, furniture, people, carpets, but all this only slightly mutes the problem. A large volume remains a large volume. Its acoustic logic doesn't disappear, which means if a room is systematically built as a huge resonant box, it might not be an accident, but a function. And here the standard tour guide version becomes especially vulnerable, because it's accustomed to speaking of beauty. But sound, that's already the language of physics. Arches, vaults, domes, the absence of central supports, deliberate proportions, all of this can be viewed as an aesthetic choice. But it can also be seen as a configuration working with a wave, an acoustic wave, a vibrational wave, possibly not just acoustic. The more closely you look at such spaces, the stronger the feeling becomes that their purpose wasn't to make it cozy for a person to talk, but for a certain process to occur inside, for something to propagate, amplify, reflect, gather at a specific point. And here, much of what previously seemed mere whimsy begins to take on new colors. Why are columns in the center unnecessary? Because they would interfere not only with the view, they would disrupt the field, the flow, the resonance, the trajectory of something important. Why is height so crucial? Because the volume itself could have been part of the work. Why does the space seem excessive? Because it only looks excessive for a ball. For a technical function, it might have been strictly justified. This isn't a final answer, but it's a very powerful shift in perspective. And after it, the old version of a spacious, beautiful hall no longer seems innocent. It seems too simplistic for a mystery of this level. And if you add another heavy block of questions, strange basements, windows at ground level, sealed doors that seem to lead nowhere, then the story begins to veer in a completely different direction. Approach an old palace and look not up, but down, at ground level, at the basement windows, at half-buried openings, at doors that suddenly meet solid earth, at facades where the lower tier looks as if it was pushed into the ground by an alien hand. We're usually offered a convenient explanation about cultural layers, the gradual raising of streets, improvements, replanning. Sometimes this holds true, but far from always, and not on the scale we see with a whole series of old complexes. All too often, basement windows look not like modest vents, but like full-fledged architectural elements. All too often, their proportions, decoration, and rhythm mirror the upper floors, as if they were never a basement in our understanding. And then an uncomfortable thought arises. What if the current ground level is a later development? What if part of the buildings truly ended up buried? Not necessarily in one day, and not necessarily in the same way everywhere, but enough that the original logic of floors and entrances was disrupted. Then many things start falling into place. Absurdly high current first floors. Huge staircases attached to buildings, as if after the main design. A strange feeling that entrances were lost somewhere, and new ones were cut not where the original project would have expected them. If a significant part of the lower volume went into the ground, then the perception of the entire building changes. What we call a hall on the first or second level could have been part of a far more complex complex. This is precisely where the alternative version of the past gains maximum unsettling force, because it's no longer just about a disputed date or a clever construction. It's about traces of a great change, after which civilization seemingly didn't build a new world from scratch, but began adapting the remnants of already existing structures for itself. Hence, the sealed doors, and the absurd additions, and the mismatch between the old and new logic of space usage. Everything looks as if someone moved into a foreign shell and began adapting it to their own capabilities. And if that's the case, then it's time to ask another question that feels particularly unsettling. Where is the normal domestic infrastructure in these buildings? Where are the traces that these were truly living spaces, or at least constantly inhabited ones? Because the more closely you look at this side of the question, the more the word palace begins to sound like a later label, not an accurate description. The domestic logic of old giant complexes is suspiciously inconsistent. We're told of luxurious life, of court, of ceremonies, of people residing within these walls for long periods. But when you start looking for the ordinary signs of such life, the questions multiply. Where is the full and comprehensible sanitation system designed for a real load? Where is the convenient internal organization for permanent habitation? Where is the engineering scheme that convincingly shows how such a space was supplied with water, heat, ventilation, and daily maintenance? Fireplaces behave especially strangely. In some cases, they give the impression of a real heat source. In others, more of a decorative device, a symbol, or an element of a different system. One encounters complex niches, metal grates, mirrored surfaces, combined channels that in places resemble a distribution or ventilation network more than an honest set of ordinary hearths. And the more such details surface, the weaker the version of simple, old-fashioned wood heating appears. This is where the boldest hypotheses are born. What if fireplaces were not stoves, but points of exit for heat or another kind of energy? What if chandeliers were not just candle holders, but part of a circuit that later generations no longer understood? What if domes, spires, metal ties, mirrors, and grills were elements of a single system, working with current, fields, air, resonance, something that would later be given a word too inconvenient and removed from the official picture? Even if not taken literally, the very train of thought is important. It forces us to look at details not as a decorator's whim, but as the trace of a function. And then a completely different image rises before our eyes. Not a luxurious house for an idle life, but a major node, a station, a resonator, a technical object whose shell has been preserved while its inner workings were pulled out, dismantled, melted down, forgotten, or deliberately concealed. And after that, all that remained for subsequent generations was to play out a beautiful story of balls, masquerades, and polite conversation. The heaviest part here is not the hypothesis itself, but how much around it suddenly starts to align. Metal in the walls, illogical scales, controversial acoustics, heating problems, basements in the ground, strange entrances, domestic incompleteness. All of this no longer looks like a scattering of coincidences. It begins to resemble a picture after a major alteration, after a purge, after the crude appropriation of someone else's legacy. And if we take this step to its conclusion, we run into the most dangerous part of history, the question of who and why rewrote the meaning of these places. This is where the familiar version of the past begins to crack, not at the seams, but in the load-bearing walls. Because if palace halls are not just staterooms, but the remnants of complex objects with a different function, then someone must have done more than just make a mistake in the description. Someone must have replaced an entire worldview, swapped out the purpose, erased the technological context, redirected people's gaze from construction to decor, from function to legend, from reality to a safe fairy tale. And then much in the history of the last 200 years begins to look different. Renovations no longer seem like harmless updates. They begin to resemble the scrubbing of traces, new facades, camouflage, the adaptation of old complexes into museums, administrations, palaces of power, not a triumph of culture, but a habit of living in shells whose meaning has been lost. People stopped understanding what was in front of them, and so they began to use it as they knew how. For ceremonies, for storage, for displaying status, for everything except the original purpose. This is where that strange, almost physical feeling in the vast halls comes from. They are empty, but do not seem dead. They hold not incompleteness, but expectation. As if the most important thing was taken from there, but the very form still remembers what it was created for. And when you stand in such a center, under a dome, amid that height, that silence, that unsettling precision, an almost unpleasant thought suddenly arrives. Before us is not a museum. Before us is the housing of a deactivated system. We are walking inside a machine we have unlearned how to understand. And this is perhaps the harshest conclusion of this entire discussion. We have lost not just some convenient technologies. We may have lost the language in which the architecture of great civilizations was itself structured. Instead of memory, we were left with decor. Instead of knowledge, ritual. Instead of function, a pretty plaque. But the halls haven't gone anywhere. They stand. They look down on us. And with every arch, every height, every hidden beam, they ask the same question. Do you really believe all this was built just for dancing? And if this investigation has made you look at an old palace differently even once, then we have already taken the first step. It only gets more interesting from here, because every such building is a separate door to a forgotten world. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and be sure to hit the bell so you don't miss the next analyses. Because perhaps the most important answers are hidden not in textbooks, but right above our heads.